Hello, friends. I am John. In today's episode, let us understand the importance of institutions in a democracy. Stay tuned. Democracy, in essence, is ruled by the people. It implies creation of political system where the effective power in a society is collectively exercised by people themselves. The democratic rule is broadly based on the universal ideals of equality, liberty, and fraternity. But in a world based on equality, who decides how these ideals will be achieved and how democracy will be operationalized? Institutions answers these questions by providing and safeguarding democratic process. The democratic processes determines what will be the nature of democracy, what are its ideal and indirectly how successful it will be. For instance, the response to COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted how countries with capable institutions were more efficient in executing the democratic processes and thus the overall outcomes. The crisis created by pandemic was accompanied by the exposure of other fault lines in democratic institutions as well. For example, the assault on the Capitol Hill in United States showcases the simmering distrust for the institution. But before we delve into these issues and find a potential solution, it becomes important to understand what are the institutions of democracy and how did they evolve? What role do they play in functioning of democracy? How does the relationship between institutions and democracy affect the development of a nation? What are the emerging challenges faced by these institutions? And what can be done to overcome these challenges and prepare institutions for the future? Now let's look at what are institutions of democracy and how did they evolve. Institution as a term is differently perceived in different contexts. When looking at them in context of application in polity, institutions can primarily be perceived in two ways. One, they can be distinct entity with clear definition, boundaries, and legal framework. For example, Parliament, Supreme Court, Election Commission, Union Public Service Commission, etc. Secondly, institutions can be set of activities happening in an informal framework which assumes significance standing in public sphere. For example, religion, culture, civil society, media, etc. Among these two types, the formal institutions such as parliament, bureaucracy, judicial, courts, etc. are the ones which are directly enabled democracy. But these institutions were not a part of ancient conception of democracy. The institutions of legislature, judiciary, executive, regulatory bodies, political parties, etc. have evolved over centuries. In ancient times, several tribes and city-states across the world practiced direct decision-making collectively by all the members of the given society. This laid the foundation of rule by the people, and in some ways the deliberative decision-making institution that acted in legislative, executive as well as judicial capacity. Over time, empires expanded and moved towards monarchical systems, but these large empires necessitated the need for separate departments within the executive body. For example, the Sandhi Vigraha was the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Gupta Empire. The administrative divisions created during these times have further evolved toward creation of separate legislative, executive and judicial agencies of today. Around 13th century, in Europe, a series of events from frequent wars, misery and a line of incompetent rulers created a scenario where power of the monarch became limited and shifted towards the deliberative decision-making body. This development started a gradual shift of power towards the people. Direct democracy and efficient administration of a large nation-state was practically impossible. As a result, to advance from monarchy towards democracy, the idea of representative democracy was adopted. Representative democracy entails a flow of power from citizen to the representative. For representative democracy to be effective, this flow of power needs to be transparent, fair, accountable, and administratively efficient. This generated the need of institutions like election authorities, accountability systems like audit mechanisms, etc. Over the course of time, democratic ideals like equality, liberty, fraternity, equity, etc. have shaped national institutions along with the global institutions like United Nations. But these ideals manifest differently in different contexts, in different societies and in different nation states. These differences in democratic value systems have culminated in different forms of democratic institutions. For example, presidential system of government versus parliamentary system of government. These contexts are influenced by the society, history, geography, and people of the region, making every democracy unique in itself. In India, some form of democracy was practiced in ancient times. in the form of sanghas and ganas around 4th century. But the form of democracy practiced currently came to India during the colonial period. The shape of India's existing institutions like parliament, government department, independent regulators, Supreme Court and High Courts, legal system, etc. have evolved over 2 centuries. But how exactly these institutions aided in development and deepening of democracy in India? Democratic institutions pave the way for open participation in the democratic process, enabling sharing of power among the citizen, thus democratizing the process. For example, election commission and parliamentary structure ensures that any citizen can form a political party and can potentially be a representative of his or her area. Also, informal institutions like media, civil society, etc., help improve people's participation by keeping citizens informed and creating indirect pressure on government by expression of public opinion. The institution acts as a custodian of democratic ideals by safeguarding the core values of a political system such as freedom, equality, sovereignty, social equity, etc. For example, the doctrine of basic structure, which has evolved through judicial pronouncements, safeguards the constitution and consequently the political legal system. Functioning of the institutions is a proxy to the functioning of the state. As a result, it is the methodic functioning of the institutions that provide legitimacy to the state. For example, inefficient and corruption-ridden utilization of tax would create distrust among taxpayers, and many indirectly threaten the financial stability of the state. Prevalence of multiple institutions like legislature, executive, judiciary, independent and autonomous bodies, and their mutually dependent relationship ensures check on each of them and thus prevents concentration of power. For instance, the emergency period in India highlighted that democracies can be imperiled if the ruling dispensation succeeded in jeopardizing the other pillars like judiciary and free press. Political parties, representatives, ideologies, etc. change regularly in accordance with the political process. But the unelected institutions like bureaucracy serve as the permanent executive and ensure, in consultation with the political executive, continuity and stability in policies. Democratic functioning of a large state like India involves various activities from election processes, recruitment, disbursement of funds, etc. Specific institutions like Election Commission, UPSC, departments within the government, respectively, help in effective and efficient discharge of these functions. The codification of rules, laws, and procedures and their implementation by the institutions ensures that citizens, when in interaction with the state, or otherwise are protected by the law. For example, irrespective of the leadership, party in power, or status of the individual, an individual can criticize the government constructively and is protected in India by right to freedom of speech, which is enforced by the judiciary. In the overall sense, institutions embody the spirit of the democracy as they move the focus and power center from an individual to entities which are open and collective in nature. Though democracy shifts focus on institutions, this does not discount the need for leaders in the system. Let us now understand how does the relationship between institutions and democracy affect the development of a nation. The interaction and importance of institutions in a democracy does not stay limited to the political realm. Its effect translates to development as well. Development, broadly understood, means improvement in countries' economic and social conditions. The collective regulatory framework created by the institutions such as laws, independent regulators, and judicial authorities in a democratic society directly impacts its social and economic functioning. For example, the labor law framework directly impacts safety and security of the workforce, alongside affecting the ease of doing business of overall economy. The nature of this framework directly influences the balance between the two objectives. Democratic institutions primarily function for the welfare of the people. To that effect, institutions in accordance with their capacity provide support in form of social and economic initiatives. For example, economic institutions like Small Industries Development Bank of India help provide credit support to micro, small and medium enterprises. As a corollary, countries with weak institutions have less capacity to provide and manage socio-economic support. For instance, the weakness of African institutions has become a significant issue in realization of benefits of development programs and projects, especially those funded by bilateral and multilateral donors. Institutions play a crucial role in maintaining social, economic, political, as well as environmental stability by ensuring rule of law. The extent of stability directly impacts the well-being and quality of life of an individual. For example, stability in price levels is strongly correlated with affordability of consumption goods, nutrition levels, and income security. Inequalities as gender, caste, income, political, regional level exist in all major democracies. The commitment of institutions in the form of laws, regulations, constitution, and processes play a crucial role in ameliorating these inequalities. For example, policy of positive discrimination in the form of reservation helps in ensuring equitable development. Also, several economic institutional tools like progressive taxation system, subsidized provision of basic consumption goods, etc., help in reducing the prevalent economic inequalities and affecting the redistribution of resources. Growth in capacity of human resources in the form of educational levels and health indicators forms an integral part of development. Creation of institutions provide a framework for development in these areas. Growth of education requires creation of the institutions like CBSE, UGC, etc., which provide clarity over curriculums, educational standards, accreditation, etc., thus paving the way of improving standards of education. Health sector requires institutions like Indian Medical Association, frameworks like Ayushman Bharat, etc., to increase accessibility as well as affordability of medical care. Democratic institutions across the world, and especially in developing countries like India, have always faced the issue of corruption, limited financial space, low availability of human resources, among others. With growing technological development, changing social fabric, and altered structures of economies, these institutions have been facing several new challenges. Autocratic functioning of the leadership may impact autonomous functioning of these institutions. This in the long run paves the way of modification and manipulation of the institution itself. For example, undermining of key democratic institutions like civil society and media by the Turkish political dispensation. Trust is the basic ingredient which provides legitimacy to the state institutions. Decrease in trust would decrease their effectiveness in the long term. For example, the assault on the Capitol Hill in the United States over fairness of election results highlights decreasing trust on citizens on efficiency of the electoral system. The value system of an evolving society continuously changes. This creates a responsibility for the institutions to keep pace with these evolving changes. A lot of time, institutions are unable to adapt simultaneously, leading to social friction. For example, gender equality has been recently coming to the forefront of India's social ethos, but military institutions are not yet ready to assimilate this change. In India, institutions are interconnected with each other, thus keeping a check on each other. This interaction tends to create an inter-institution friction when power overlap. For example, several experts have highlighted that increased frequency of judicial pronouncements in executive domain can be a source of friction between these two institutions. Technological penetration, along with limited capacity development of institutional functionaries, has made functioning of several institutions difficult. For example, security apparatus has not been able to cope up with growing cybersecurity issues and threat. The problem gets further compounded with static nature of the institutions, which are not subject to regular reform, many of which are still operating under the colonial era laws. In the current information age, awareness about one's right to service has drastically increased. This has raised expectations across the institutions for faster, inclusive, and better quality processes. The rise in expectation has not been matched with infrastructural and human resource development, thus creating a gulf between expectations and the current quality of processes. India is a large country with close to 1.3 billion people, where majority of the landscape is rural in nature. In such a scenario, the ability of the institutions to reach out and function effectively in these areas remain limited. For instance, access to judicial processes still remains limited to a minuscule population. This is further constrained by poor understanding of laws and limited literacy level. Let us now quickly look at what can be done to overcome these challenges and prepare institutions for the future. Institutions which operate with limited autonomy and at the discretion of the leadership face a persistent threat of interference and even deinstitutionalization. Empowering formal institutions like judiciary, independent regulators, etc., by increasing their autonomy, and also informal institutions like civil society, media, etc., by creating mechanisms to safeguard their rights could help overcome this issue. In the rapidly changing times, institutions tend to get disconnected from the socio-economic context. To address this, the nature of the institutions itself can be made more dynamic. For example, making institutional reforms like updating administrative regulations as a part of regular process will be a step in right direction. Also, technological upgradation in the form of digitization, cybersecurity apparatus, citizen access, etc. will be integral to the development of any dynamic institution in the future. The primary reason behind inter-institutional friction is the presence of power vacuum or lack of clarity over distribution of powers. There is a need to identify such power vacuums or ambiguities. Instances of conflicts within institutions should be used as an opportunity to further clarify the role and domain of respective institutions. The problem of limited resources faced by the institutions manifests in their limited capacity and suboptimal outcomes in overall democratic processes. Expanding the capacity of these institutions will have a multiplier effect on every aspect that the democratic processes touch upon. For example, strengthening fiscal capacity of Panchayati Raj institutions will have a direct multiplier effect on rural development. Trust deficit arises due to opacity in functioning and absence of accountability mechanisms. Although some efforts have been made to increase transparency and accountability in the form of right to information, social audits, etc., further efforts in the form of actively making information public, developing new standards and commitments, and following up with the consequences and responsive actions are desirable. Improving transparency and accountability mechanisms may increase the trust on institutions, but the citizens still remain passive participants in the institutional process. To increase the legitimacy of the institutional process and acceptance for its decision, making public participation an integral part of the process becomes important. This public participation can be integrated through deliberative processes, creation of discussion rooms, opening ideas and policies for suggestions, and encourage participation decision making wherever possible. To conclude, institutions in a democracy, both formal and informal, provide the framework for realization of democratic ideals, making institutions a tool which operationalize democracy. The functioning of these institutions affects all facets of life of a citizen. Although democratic institutions have come a long way over the centuries, dynamic nature of the society demands their continuous evolution. They presently face several challenges with regard to their legitimacy, power distribution, efficiency, and their overall capacity. Political efforts alongside investment of resources will have to be made to overcome these challenges and prepare institutions for the future. Development and upgradation of institutions may seem like an expensive, difficult, and time-consuming exercise. But as democracy has stood above all other political systems in the long run, similarly, institutional development has emerged as the best possible way to realize a fulfilling democracy in the long run. For more videos like this, make sure to click subscribe and hit the bell icon.